Thank you all very much for joining us today for our brown bag discussion about Lincoln and the problem of freedom and our celebration of the 205th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. This is as part of the exhibit that you see around the room, which is called Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War. And we do have a whole series of programs that are going on throughout February and March. And so those are described in the handouts that are on some of the tables. If you haven't seen one, feel free to grab one. And then we're also happy that the local Chamber of Commerce put together something called the Passport to Fun, which gives you coupons to 7, I think, different restaurants here in the area. Sort of as a connection when you're here at the exhibit, maybe you want to go spend some money here in Champaign County. We have copies of these available if you have people coming in from out of town between now and March 20th. Those coupons would be good regardless of whether you come to the exhibit, although we hope you'll bring them back to see the exhibit. Our presenter today is Dr. Mike Rhyne, who is an associate professor of history here at Urbana University. He holds a Ph.D. in history from the University of Cincinnati, where his major area of concentration was American history. His dissertation focused on emancipation in Civil War era Kentucky, and he has published several scholarly articles on this subject. His book, Terror is at Hand, Race, Violence, and the Law in Post-Emancipation Kentucky, is under advanced contract with the Southern Illinois University Press. Our exhibit today is a traveling exhibition for libraries, and it was organized by the National Constitution Center and the American Library Association Public Programs Office. The traveling exhibition was made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War is based on an exhibition of the same name that was developed by the National Constitution Center. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and I'll turn everything over to Dr. Rhyne.
Thank you. I'll have to get used to the microphone. Normally, when our librarian calls me, the first question I ask myself is, okay, who do I have to become today? The first call came before I even received my first paycheck at Urbana, and I had to become an expert on Ben Franklin within a matter of a few weeks, and we did that quite nicely. So it was a real pleasure to get this call, because this is actually my field of expertise. This is the area of the Civil War with which I'm most familiar, and it is at the heart of what I've done research on over the last couple of decades. And so this one was an easy one. I didn't even have to fake it.
Very good. We're not going to watch a movie?
Yeah. Oh, you cracked me up, Kevin. In 1864, the governor of Kentucky wrote a scathing letter to Abraham Lincoln asking why Kentucky was having to bear such unequal burdens, why Kentucky was in essence being picked on. In the context of that letter, he called the government policy regarding emancipation a blood-stained sin. That the reality that Lincoln had somehow turned this war into a war of emancipation was so infuriating to Thomas Bramlett of Kentucky that he felt compelled to write this letter. Mind you, this is Thomas Bramlett, the unconditional unionist governor of loyal Kentucky, not the sort of fake governor of Kentucky that was put in place by the Confederate invading force, the one duly elected in 1863 to lead Kentucky as a member of the United States in suppressing this rebellion, as Lincoln called it. So for him to become that angry with his commander-in-chief gives you some idea of the hostility that the subject of emancipation had provoked from a great many people. Of course, there were a number of Ohioans who were upset about this as well. They were pejoratively labeled copperheads by their detractors, but Cincinnati was apparently full of them. It's often described as that kind of snakes den, and Clement Vallandigham is a famous name of a person who was greatly at odds with the Lincoln administration. So what I want to do today is look at the story of emancipation as a process. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, and you know that that's the way I like for you to think about it, as a process, and to look at particularly acts of self-emancipation and how, in fact, federal wartime policy was not so much what Bramlett perceived it to be, which was this sort of radical reshaping on the part of a tyrannical president, but emancipation was a fact. It was a reality to which the Lincoln administration was responding. So that's what we want to look at today. We want to address first and foremost the myth of Lincoln as the great emancipator. And you can see that it shows the standing Lincoln and the kneeling slave. Well, the image of the kneeling slave was very popular in the late 19th century, and it was generally a way of saying that slaves couldn't possibly have freed themselves without the help of the great emancipator. And so we begin with that statue sort of to give you a glimpse of the myth, and we'll end it with an image that also focuses on the enduring myth of Lincoln as the emancipator. Well, politics of emancipation. When the Civil War began, Lincoln was dead set against emancipation as a war aim. Why would he be dead set against that? Well, because he didn't want to lose Kentucky. He said this over and over, that any move that would endanger or perhaps incite Kentucky's secession was a move he could not afford to make. Of course, he also wanted to maintain the loyalty of Delaware and Maryland in particular is where we see him using a pretty heavy hand to make sure that Maryland remains loyal, using military occupation in Baltimore and elsewhere as a means to do that. But Kentucky he treated with kid gloves. When the Kentucky governor, Beriah McGoffin, at the beginning of the war said, well, we kind of want to remain neutral. We'll just sit this one out and see how the war goes. Lincoln didn't directly challenge that. In fact, he overtly seemed to allow Kentucky that neutrality temporarily. Well, covertly, his administration was moving weapons into Kentucky and making plans to establish recruiting camps in Kentucky. And all of that eventually becomes a more overt operation. Nonetheless, he states that he's not going to interfere with slavery in Kentucky. Now, we know that some of those Union commanders coming down from the Midwest had different ideas when they got to Kentucky, and they began helping slaves liberate themselves. They would harbor fugitives in their camps. They would help slaves get north to the Ohio River. They would even buy tickets for steamboat passage across to the free states of Indiana and Ohio. But that was not sanctioned by the Lincoln administration. Within that administration, as we know, thanks to Doris Kearns Goodwin and others, were a lot of people who disagreed with Lincoln, and some of them were radical abolitionists, something that Lincoln never would admit to being. In fact, he defended himself as not being an abolitionist when challenged by Stephen A. Douglas. But within that network of Republican leadership, there were abolitionist voices. William Seward, for one, was calling for emancipation. By the beginning of 1862, when it's clear this is going to be a longer war after the debacle at Bull Run, or First Manassas, if you prefer. Don't know what side of the border you're from, so I'll play it both ways. As the line from Josie Wales says, you have to be able to whistle Dixie and sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic with equal enthusiasm along the Ohio River, anyway, as you did along the Missouri River. Thaddeus Stevens is the powerful Speaker of the House at this time. And Stevens makes an impassioned call for using emancipation as a vehicle for winning the war. In other words, he is one of the first really outspoken Republican leaders to say, emancipation should be the price of rebellion. if you're going to rebel and take up arms against the flag of the United States, which my great-great-grandfather did, maybe some of your ancestors did, in Thaddeus Stevens' mind, that was a serious insult to that flag. And I dare say today that, you know, we would call these people terrorists and be first in line to say they ought to be stood up and shot. That probably crossed Thaddeus Stevens' mind too. But at least there should be a punishment for inciting this rebellion and for breaking away from the Union and for taking up arms against the flag. And that punishment in the mind of Stevens should be loss of slave property, okay? So he calls for this in January 1862. Well, even as Stevens is arguing with the Lincoln administration about issues like emancipation, the reality is that emancipation is already taking place. This is a cartoon rendering of what was happening down at Fortress Monroe on the peninsula of Virginia. The commander down there, a Republican politician, Ben Butler, had begun liberating slaves who fled to his camp. And we have a classic example here of a Colonel Mallory. He's a colonel in the Confederate Army who has 3 slaves run away to Butler's camp down there at Fortress Monroe, where he was dug in. And Butler says, I'm not going to send these slaves back. His logic's simple. If a keg of gunpowder got up and walked from the Confederate lines to the Union lines, you wouldn't take that keg of gunpowder back so they could load it in a cannon and blast away at you, right? His argument is that slaves were contraband of war. They were being used as resources to wage war of rebellion. Therefore, he saw it within his authority to confiscate slaves that ran to his lines. Well, he infuriated Lincoln when he did this, because he had no legitimate authority in Lincoln's mind to make that decision himself. And Lincoln was very frustrated about this because it was pushing his hand in a way that Lincoln didn't like to have his hand pushed. So Lincoln got mad at him. He got mad at Margaret's old friend Don Piatt and several others over the same kinds of action of trying to advance emancipation faster than Lincoln was willing to go. So Butler gets in trouble, but on the other hand, Congress reasons what he's doing isn't wrong. We need to legitimate this. We don't want to send these slaves back to go to work, to dig trenches and gun emplacements that then are going to be the source of fire that's going to kill our boys. So we're not going to send them back. So what Congress does then is to enact the Second Confiscation Act. The Second Confiscation Act, which Lincoln signs into law, legitimates 2 things. First of all, it says, and this is the first time we really see this in print, that the price of rebellion is forfeiture of slave property. So in other words, if you are a Kentuckian who has Southern sympathies or can be convicted of supporting the Southern war effort or aiding and abetting the enemy, or a Marylander or someone along those border states, and you are convicted of this in court, then you can be fined, you can be sentenced to a prison term, and you forfeit your slave property if you own any slaves. So this is the first time we see the federal government doing this. The state of Kentucky actually was already doing this. The state of Kentucky allowed marshals to seize property of known Confederates and sell it at auction to pay off the debts. And amazingly enough, the debts always equaled the exact amount of the proceeds of the auction. Kind of interesting how that math works. But Kentuckians were already doing this. So when Lincoln authorizes or signs the Second Confiscation Act into law, Kentuckians are furious. They're like, we're already doing this. You're taking money out of our pockets. Now you're going to take those slaves and do with them what you will, put them to work for your war effort. We can't sell them to recoup debts. Because, see, slavery was perfectly legal in Kentucky. Buying and selling slaves was perfectly legal in Kentucky. And so when they confiscated slaves, they sold them as property to recoup money. Under the Second Confiscation Act, slaves confiscated from known Confederates were to be freed. So this is the beginning of formal emancipation on the part of the federal government. Also in that act, Section 9 legitimates what Ben Butler was already doing. And it says that slaves who flee to the Union lines or slaves in areas that the Union Army advances into, slaves of known Confederates can be and should be emancipated and never again held as slaves. So this is a permanent emancipation that we see now taking place under the guidelines of the Second Confiscation Act. Well, this is roughly the map that we think of when we think of the Civil War. This is roughly 1864. You can see that West Virginia has been created here. And canes are very handy, by the way. You should carry one. I recommend a nice wormy walnut. It's a rather pretty cane. But they're handy as pointers, and you can also smack the table to get students' attention or do things like that. This is the Confederacy as we understand it, and then Indian Territory, technically neutral, but leaning toward the Confederacy. After all, it was the men in blue coats who drove many of those folks to Oklahoma. Never mind that many of those blue coats were Southern speaking, but anyway. Missouri and Kentucky on the border, claimed by both sides. In fact, the Confederate flag has stars for Missouri and Kentucky, if you didn't know that. They counted them as Confederate states, but the state governments of Missouri and Kentucky did not count themselves as Confederates. They counted themselves as Unionists. But big slaveholding areas, especially Kentucky. Kentucky had over 200,000 slaves in 1860, of which almost half were younger than 15 years old. That is a huge capital investment. And the only way to reap that capital investment is to sell those slaves to where the biggest market is. And where's the biggest market? Down here, the Cotton Kingdom. Okay? So when this war breaks out, this is bad for business in the state of Kentucky, to say the least. They aren't going to be able to reap the huge profits they had dreamed of as those slaves were being born. They do hope to get some compensation for their losses. And so as policies play out, Kentuckians become more and more frustrated as it becomes clear that they're going to lose at all turns. So keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, I put this map up here so I can tell you that this map is wrong. Okay? This map is not how you should view the Civil War. It is a war between states. I don't diss that argument. It begins that way. All the armies are raised by state levies and state efforts to raise armies. It is a war between the states, but it quickly becomes much messier. This is the real map of the Civil War, okay? This is the map of who controls what. That's the nature of this war. Who controls what? That means a heck of a lot more than state boundaries. In 1862, most of West Tennessee is under the control of the Union Army. That's a huge number of slaves and a huge cotton producing capability that is now under control of the Union Army. New Orleans is under control of the Union Army, and much of the prime cotton land on both sides of the Mississippi and the lower Mississippi, all under control of the Union Army, all being urged to go back to work, to keep planting cotton, to keep growing those resources so that the Union can benefit from them. Okay? All of that is in place. By the time that we even begin talking about an Emancipation Proclamation, much of the prime cotton country of the South has been falling into Union hands. They already control this. So those areas are areas where slaves could flock to Union lines, and they may be put to work on a cotton plantation, but at least they had that sense that they weren't supporting the Confederate war effort. So you see a lot of turmoil in these areas as well. Widespread guerrilla warfare breaks out in West Tennessee. People who had welcomed the Union occupation soon found out it wasn't exactly what they had bargained for. And so there's a lot of unrest in these areas. By 63, of course, we have the Great Push that culminates with the fall of Vicksburg in July 4th, 1863, and I like to mark that day as the day the Civil War should have ended. Unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of people were yet to suffer horrible injuries and death because the war didn't end, but that's when the Union won the war. That's when they won it. They turned Lee back at Gettysburg, as my friend there can tell you all about in exquisite detail, and they cut the Mississippi. They controlled the entire Mississippi and the South's cotton heartland. South had bet everything on King Cotton. They lost at that point. At that point, their gamble was over. It was just a matter of logistics from that point on. And popular will, that most important thing that my generation knows well, because we saw it play out in Vietnam, we've seen it play out elsewhere, and your younger generations are seeing it play out in Afghanistan, Iraq, those kinds of places. Popular will is important to this too. But as far as the strategy has worked by this point, by 1863. This is all before the Emancipation Proclamation really has a big impact, okay? The war is pretty much already decided. It's a matter of logistics from that point on. Well, Lincoln, of course, issues his preliminary proclamation after the Battle of Antietam, a technical victory in that Lee had to retreat, and that was seen as a good thing. And so Lincoln gives his preliminary proclamation. The proclamation is, of course, an extension of what Thaddeus Stevens had called for in January of that year. And that is to make emancipation the price of ongoing rebellion. See, what Lincoln does in September is say, okay, you've got about 3 months to make up your minds. Are you going to keep seceding and rebelling, or are you going to give up and put down your weapons and let's work a deal to resolve this? Because here's what's going to happen. If you don't cease and desist from rebelling, I'm going to take away your slaves. Lincoln doesn't ask Congress for power to do this. He doesn't even consult with them, although many in Congress favored his actions. He does this unilaterally because he can. Why can he do this? Because the Constitution grants extraordinary presidential power to suppress a rebellion. From day one, Lincoln had said, this is a rebellion. This is not an independence movement or a battle between two nations. This is a rebellion. And the Constitution gave the president that power. Why? Shays' Rebellion, but that's another lecture. They wanted George Washington to have that power, and you gave it to Washington, and along comes Lincoln, and he's got the power too. That's the way it plays out. Which is why people always have fear and trembling any given change of administration, because we change the laws and we change aspects of governance, and then the next administration inherits it, and we go, oh man, that was a mistake. We should never have done that. Well, the formal proclamation, as you know, really didn't liberate a whole lot of people, but it set the tone for liberation. From January 1 on, slaves in the former Confederacy, the areas still rebelling, the areas not occupied by the Union Army, going back to that real map of the war, the areas not occupied by the Union Army, those slaves are now free. So if the Confederacy loses the war, they lose all their remaining slave property. Absolutely, unequivocally gone. All of that human capital disappears if they lose the war. That's why the war's so intense in '64. Because by that time, there is no negotiating out of it. There is no backing up. If they lose this war, they lose their slaves. That's why they fight so hard in '64 to try to maintain the Confederacy. Because now it's all or nothing. This isn't a war about negotiating some kind of different status or better protection for the future of slavery. This is now a war for survival. And that's one of the reasons we think they fought so hard in '64, was because they knew by this time. Well, in issuing the proclamation, Lincoln also authorizes the recruitment of black troops. And so we begin to see at this point active recruitment of African Americans. This is a classic stock photo. These are members of the United States Colored Troop at Fort Lincoln, which was built after Lincoln's death, I think. But it's one of the forts around Washington, D.C. And this is November '65 or something, I think, when this was taken. But recruitment of black troops, it had already begun in Massachusetts with the 54th and 55th. It had begun in Ohio with the 127th. Now it's all legitimated under the federal banner, under the category of United States Colored Troops. And so these troops are being recruited. They can include free blacks from the north, including free blacks from Canada who had fled to Canada. They came back to join some of these regiments like the 54th and 55th. But you can also recruit slaves. Lincoln initially calls for the exclusion of recruitment in Kentucky. Don't recruit in Kentucky, they're mad enough at me already. Okay, and they were. They were. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply at all to Kentucky, but it set the tone for extraordinary use of presidential power that made Kentuckians very queasy. See, the Kentucky governor, Thomas Bramlett, was not a Republican. He was a Democrat. And in the 1860s, Democrats were your state and local guys. I don't think Ryan could join us today, but I know you know this, Brooke, because he talks about it all the time. And I hear you ask Mr. Lincoln a question about this yourself. They were the big state and local party. They didn't think a strong national government should have the kind of authority Lincoln was using. So he may be loyal, Bramlett may be loyal, he once wore the Union uniform, but he's not a Republican. And he strongly disagrees with this expansion of federal authority that he sees playing out. So Lincoln sort of says, okay, we'll back off. We won't recruit in Kentucky. But, you know, slaves in Kentucky have a way of having their own minds and their own opinions. So what happens, I shouldn't have clicked just yet, but I need to forward my speech or I'll never get to the assassination. The way the story plays out in Kentucky is that slaves begin trying to join the army. So much so that the military governor of Kentucky, I can't remember his exact status, Stephen Burbridge, who was in charge of Kentucky as a military zone. That is one of the things that happened in '63 is Kentucky had been declared under martial law. And so while you do have a civilian government, you also have military government under Burbridge. Again, a man that Bramlett had handpicked and begged Lincoln to appoint and then regretted that almost from day one. But Burbridge is faced with this crisis. He has hordes of slaves running away from farm and field trying to join the army. He has an uneven policy on the part of the Union because some commanders harbored those runaways, even though they had no legal authority to do so, while others turned them away. He's got mobs of infuriated slaveholders and their allies who are targeting these people attempting to volunteer, oftentimes capturing them, beating them, cutting off an ear, other kinds of punishment, and sometimes outright killing people who run away and try to volunteer. And so he reasons he has to do something. The slaveholders in Kentucky are out of control in his mind. Burbridge was a slaveholder over in Bourbon County. He grew up in a slaveholding family. And so he has to do something. So he opens prosecuting the war to the end, to ultimate military victory. Well, when Lincoln wins that, when he wins that re-election, that is his mandate to win the war. But he also has been working on a policy for winning the peace. Lincoln is a great politician, an absolutely brilliant politician. And he understands that you can't just win the war, you've got to win the peace. So he's already enacting very lenient policies. This is a cartoon from the election, Jeff Davis and Abe Lincoln trying to tear the country apart, and poor old, much maligned George McClellan trying to hold it together as the peace candidate. Very, very good cartoon from the era. Well, how do you win the peace? Lincoln, since 1863, had promoted a plan of lenient Reconstruction. First of all, he issues proclamations of amnesty if you swear the ironclad oath. If you swear the oath of allegiance to the United States that you'll never again take up arms against the United States, then you're readmitted to the Union. And once you get a good 10% or so of your population of a state, your voters, to swear that ironclad oath, then you can begin governing yourselves. You can begin restructuring your own state governments. This policy is so successful that by the time the war ends, Tennessee is already fully readmitted to the Union. Okay? They've already gone through all the steps that Lincoln asked them to do. They have a Republican governor, Parson Brownlow, another lecture for another time, the infamous Parson Brownlow of Tennessee. They have all of these things in place, and so they're readmitted. That is Lincoln's plan for winning the peace. This would allow former Confederates to reestablish themselves as political leaders. They would not be rounded up wholesale and imprisoned. Lincoln has a very lenient model, as long as you swear the loyalty. Lincoln's model does not address black citizenship whatsoever, even though he realizes by 64, of course, that the war is going to end with slavery destroyed if he wins. There is no model for black citizenship. And here is another great cartoon from the period. This is Andrew Johnson, again with Tennessee. Andrew Johnson, senator from Tennessee, Democrat. Lincoln picks him as his running mate because Johnson, when Tennessee seceded, Johnson said, okay, go, I'm staying. And so he chose to remain loyal. He becomes the wartime Reconstruction governor of Tennessee, and Lincoln asked him to step aside from that position to become his running mate in 64. So Andrew Johnson, the Southern Democrat, is now the duly elected Vice President of the United States. As somebody no doubt pointed out after the fact, one heartbeat away from the Oval Office, right? Just like Teddy Roosevelt. Interesting how these things play out. So Andrew Johnson and Abraham Lincoln are trying to sew the Union back together, and Lincoln, the old rail splitter, is using his freakish strength to pry the country back together while Johnson stitches it up. Quite an interesting cartoon, and Johnson saying, take it quietly, Uncle Abe, and I will draw it closer than ever. And Abe saying, a few more stitches, Andy, and the good old Union will be mended. Johnson thought he understood the mind of Lincoln. He thought he understood Lincoln's leniency during the war as a direction Lincoln would take after the war. And of course, that leads to the very interesting presidency of Andrew Johnson. So many lectures, so little time. Well, as I said, Lincoln had never really addressed the issue of black citizenship. In his second inaugural address, he blames this sort of amorphous slave power or slave interest as being at the root cause of the war, but he also talks in terms of that we don't expect to hear a president use. Lincoln doesn't say, we're on the side of right, and right will win, and all of that. He doesn't say that at all. He basically says, I defer to God's judgment. And all of us somehow are complicit in what has happened to our country. And if it is God's judgment that every drop of blood shed by slaves at the hands of brutal masters and drivers and all of that, every drop of blood shed with the whip, if that has to be repaid with blood shed on the battlefields, in essence, then that's God's will. It's very rare that you hear a president say that kind of thing. To take a neutral position on this, even though he's definitely in it to win it, right? Lincoln wants to win this war. He believes it's absolutely essential. He doesn't say his side was on the right and the other side was on the wrong. He says we're all complicit in this, and the catastrophe of this war is God's judgment on us for the sin of slavery, in essence. So Lincoln is looking for some atonement out of this war as a way to bring the nation together. It's quite a moving speech and quite theological. in its depth and content. And a very, very interesting speech for a wartime president whose side is winning the war to make at that point. But Lincoln is inaugurated for his second term. John Wilkes Booth, of course, has been hatching plots for quite a while now to kidnap Lincoln. Booth is a diehard Confederate. Look, when old John Brown was captured at Harper's Ferry, John Wilkes Booth went out and begged a Virginia militiaman for a uniform so that he could attend the hanging, right? And he shows up at John Brown's hanging. He was a diehard Confederate, and he saw the Confederacy falling apart, and so he began hatching plans. Well, if I can kidnap Lincoln, that's a powerful bargaining chip, right? Maybe this will rejuvenate the Confederacy, or maybe it will allow us to work out some kind of deal. Well, with Appomattox, of course, Booth's dreams and a lot of other Confederate dreams come to an end. The seemingly unbeatable Robert E. Lee is finally brought to heel and forced to surrender. It's not the end of the war. Everybody says Appomattox is the end of the war. No, the war went on in some places for years. But it is the end of a dream. And that dream was the Confederacy as an independent country. That's not going to happen. The question then becomes, well, do we keep fighting a guerrilla war, and what can we do now, and can we maybe salvage part of this? But the great dream is lost there. Booth knows this, a lot of people know it, but it's a bitter pill to swallow. So, after Appomattox, there's a tremendous amount of anger and frustration among many Confederate sympathizers. Lincoln, on the other hand, has felt as if a great weight has been lifted off of him. He always said the war would consume him. That, he and the war were on a path that pretty much when the war ended, he figured he would be at an end too. And you can see, if you look at photos of Lincoln, how rapidly he aged. Of course, we see that all the time now, because the presidency is pretty much the highest stress job in the world, as far as I can tell. Look at Barack Obama these days. My goodness, where is that young man who ran for office in 2008? Lincoln has aged dramatically during the war. You can see that in the photographs of him. So he's won the war. He goes to Richmond, takes a tour of the city with his son, sees the kind of damage that the war had inflicted. Of course, part of that was the Confederate retreat and blowing stuff up and things like that. But Richmond looks like a scene from one of the bombing raids of World War II or something. Just burned out, bombed out city. Lincoln tours that, and he goes back to Washington, and people are gathering around. Well, you got to say something, Mr. Lincoln. You got to say something. Lee surrendered. The war is over. Give us a speech. So he comes out on the balcony of the White House, or the portico, or someplace in the White House, and he delivers a speech. And it's not Lincoln on his A game. It's not the Gettysburg Address. It's kind of winding and disconnected. But he's putting forth some of his ideas about Reconstruction. And as he's winding down the speech, he makes a comment that, well, I think we're going to have to give some of them the vote. Now, is he talking about extending the franchise to educated African Americans, maybe free blacks living in the North who had more opportunities? Is he talking about giving the vote to former slaves? It's a little unclear to us what Lincoln actually intended, but when Booth hears this, he basically says, that's Negro citizenship. And he probably said it in a much more vulgar way than that. And he says, now by God, I'll put him through. This is the last speech he'll ever give, and it was. As we know, at Ford's Theater, Lincoln was shot in the back of the head by Booth and died the next morning, leaving the very contentious government in the hands of Andrew Johnson, the Southern Democrat, and Thaddeus Stevens, the Northern Republican abolitionist. And so it would go. I need an extra hand. Okay. Well, I said I was going to leave you with the image of the great emancipator, and this is a depiction of Lincoln walking the streets in Richmond. And I have no doubt that many African Americans ran to Lincoln, wanted to touch his coat, wanted to shake his hand. He had already become a legend in their minds because he was the great emancipator. No matter how many tens of thousands had emancipated themselves by running away, no matter that the Union Army really was the sword of emancipation as it won the battles that won the war, Lincoln was seen as the great emancipator. And in fact, in later years, if you go to the slave narratives, the WPA slave narratives and other accounts of slaves who are very old people by that time, but recalling their life as slaves, many of them claim that Lincoln himself actually came to their plantation and opened the gate and set them free. You see that coming up over and over again as these old people recount, and they'll say something like that. Why they said it, whether it was for the interviewer's ears or whatever, but that's what they say. Lincoln came to the gate, and he opened the gate, and he set us free. You hear that, you see that in those narratives. What I would like to leave you with is that that was a part of the myth of Lincoln that developed very quickly, even before his death. It had spread and would continue to spread after his death, because then we have the martyred Lincoln, the Christ figure, who has died for the sin of slavery to make that final act of redemption so that the nation could move forward. And that's the Lincoln that we've all too often memorialized. I find the real Lincoln to be infinitely more fascinating than that. He was not a saint by any stretch of the imagination, and if you believe his former law partner, he was quite the randy fellow. I don't know how much of Herndon I believe, but it's interesting reading, very lively. But Lincoln the politician was incredibly complex. Some things, he was totally hands-off. He let Congress do what it needed to do. Other things, he was very much a hands-on manager. The war, he was one of the most hands-on commander-in-chief we've ever had. Him and James K. Polk probably take the top award for micromanaging the war. But the great emancipator, not so much. The reluctant emancipator, I can buy that. The person who is evolving in his thinking about black equality, I can buy that as well. But he's not William Lloyd Garrison. We shouldn't paint him as William Lloyd Garrison. He's not a racial egalitarian. He's not a radical abolitionist. He was an extraordinary president who took extraordinary action to do what he felt the country needed to do in order for it to survive. So Thomas Bramlett aside, and many other very, very upset Kentuckians who mourned Lincoln for maybe 5 minutes, and then they got on with the business of trying to break away from the government after the fact, secede after the fact, as we joke about in Kentucky. Aside from all of that, I leave you with that Lincoln, the complex man, the reluctant emancipator, but the power behind this push to prosecute the war to victory, knowing in the end that that victory would mean ratification of the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery forever in the United States. Thanks so much for coming, and happy birthday, Mr. Lincoln.